Hey, before anything else, quick heads up. This is an audio story, so feel free to just let it play in the background, doing dishes, driving, folding laundry, whatever you've got going on. But if you've got 2 seconds, hit subscribe and drop a like before we get into it. I know everybody says that, but I mean it. It actually makes a real difference for a small channel like this one, and it costs you absolutely nothing. Okay. Let's get into it. So, the day I found out my own son had been logging into my bank account for 8 months straight, I was sitting at my kitchen table holding a phone bill for a phone plan I didn't even remember signing up for. Derek had helped me switch carriers back in March, he said, to save me some money. Turned out he'd switched a few other things around while he was at it. My whole financial life, basically. Quietly, one form at a time, one login at a time, while I was none the wiser. Hi, I'm Linda. I'm 71 years old, and before I lay out the whole mess for you, I'd love to know where everybody's listening from tonight. Drop it in the comments, your city, your state, your country, whatever you feel like sharing. I read every single one of them. It's honestly become the best part of putting these stories together. All right, buckle in, because this one's got some real twists and turns in it, and I don't want to rush past any of it. So let me start from the actual beginning, the boring part, because I think it matters. My husband Gary passed almost 5 years ago now. Heart attack, sudden, no warning at all. One Saturday afternoon, he was hollering at the umpire on TV during a Reds game, like the man could hear him through the screen. And by that Sunday night, I was sitting in a funeral home picking out a casket, like it was some kind of terrible multiple-choice test. 38 years married. We had a decent, boring, happy life, is the honest way to put it. The kind you don't fully appreciate until it's just you rattling around a 3-bedroom house in a Cincinnati suburb with nobody left to argue with about the thermostat. I met Gary at a roller rink, if you can believe that, back in 1974. I was 19, working the concession stand for spending money, and he came in with a group of buddies from the plant, already balding at 22, which he used to joke about more than anybody else ever did. He could not skate to save his life. Fell down twice in the first 10 minutes, laughed about it both times, got right back up. I remember thinking, watching him pick himself up off that rink floor a second time, that there was something in a man who could be that clumsy in public and not seem to mind one bit who was watching. We were married 11 months later, in my parents' backyard, folding chairs borrowed from the church, a cake my mother made herself because we couldn't afford a bakery one. 38 years is a long stretch of time to spend building a life with somebody. And I want to be honest, it wasn't some fairy tale the whole way through. We had our stretches, especially those first few years when money was tight and Derek came along sooner than we'd really planned for. And there was a rough patch in the mid-'80s when Gary lost a job for the better part of a year, and it put a strain on both of us that took a while to fully heal from. But we came out the other side of every one of those rough patches still choosing each other, is the best way I know to put it. And by the time he passed, we'd gotten to be the kind of old married couple who could carry on an entire conversation using about 6 words and a look. I still reach for the phone some evenings to tell him something funny that happened during my day, out of pure old habit, before I remember. That part, I don't imagine ever fully goes away. And at this point, I've stopped expecting it to. Gary left me okay financially. Not rich, not even close, but okay. The house was paid off, free and clear. He had a modest life insurance policy through his union and a pension from the utility company he put in 31 years at. I wasn't going to be eating cat food in my old age, is what I'm telling you. I want that established clearly right up front, because it ends up mattering a whole lot later in this story. We raised 2 kids together. Derek, he's 44 now, and Amanda, 41. And look, I love my son, I do. That never stopped being true even through everything I'm about to tell you. But Derek has had one business idea after another since he was maybe 25 years old, and none of them have ever quite landed the way he swears the next one will. There was the food truck. That lasted about 14 months before the truck itself got repossessed. Then some kind of online supplement business, protein powders. I never fully understood what made his different from the 1,000 others out there. Then a pool cleaning franchise that fell apart spectacularly when the man who sold it to him turned out to be running the whole thing as some kind of pyramid scheme, which cost Derek a legal headache and a good chunk of change he genuinely did not have to lose. Derek married young, to a woman named Patrice, and they had a daughter, my granddaughter Sophie, who's 16 now. That marriage ended in divorce about 4 years back, amicably enough as these things go, and Sophie splits time between them but comes to see me most Sunday afternoons on her own, which I've always treasured. Every one of Derek's business failures, in the telling, is somebody else's fault. A bad partner, bad timing, bad luck, and every single time, somehow, it costs money he doesn't quite have, and somehow, he always finds a way to keep going, keep believing the next one's the one that finally works. Amanda's more settled by comparison. Married to a nice enough fellow named Todd, 2 kids, works in insurance claims processing for a regional company, lives about 40 minutes from me out past the interstate. She's not a bad person, not even close. She's just conflict-averse is, I think, the kindest way I can put it. If Derek stood in her kitchen and told her the sky was green, Amanda would nod along and quietly go along with it rather than deal with the argument that would follow if she pushed back. That particular family trait, I'll tell you right now, ends up mattering a great deal in how all of this played out. For the first 4 years after Gary passed, honestly, things were fine. Maybe even good in their own quiet way. I traveled a little on my own terms, did a bus trip up to see the fall colors in Vermont with my friend Carol 2 autumns running, went to every single one of Amanda's daughter Grace's dance recitals, no matter how far a drive it was, kept up the vegetable garden that Gary always teased me for babying too much, God rest him. I wasn't lonely exactly, though I won't sit here and pretend some nights weren't hard, because they absolutely were. I had my routines, and routines matter more than people realize when you're getting older on your own. Church on Sunday mornings at Grace Methodist, where I've sat in roughly the same pew for 20-some years. Book club every other Thursday evening at the library. A standing coffee date with Carol every single Tuesday morning at 9 at the same diner, in the same booth that we've kept up for going on 30 years now, through both our marriages, through Gary's funeral, through Carol's divorce back in the 90s, through all of it. Then, last October, I had a fall. Nothing dramatic in the moment, or so I thought. I was reaching up onto a high shelf in the kitchen for a casserole dish I only use at Thanksgiving, lost my footing on the little step stool, and went down hard on my right hip. I lay there on that kitchen floor for a good few minutes before I could even get my breath enough to reach my phone, which had skittered under the table when I fell. And I remember the specific, cold sort of fear of being down on the ground, alone in your own house, with nobody due to check on you for hours yet. Turned out to be a bad, deep bruise, thank God, not an actual break, though I was in the emergency room for about half a day getting x-rayed and poked at to make sure. The ER doctor, a young fellow who couldn't have been much past 30, kept calling me young lady in that particular way doctors do with older patients, which I found more amusing than anything. But word got around the family fast, the way these things do once one person knows. And that hospital visit, Looking back on it now with everything I know, is really where this whole story actually starts, even though at the time it felt like nothing more than a scare that passed. Derek showed up at the hospital before Amanda even did, which, I'll be honest with you, surprised me a little in the moment, and in hindsight probably should have told me something right then and there. Amanda didn't arrive for almost 3 hours, held up at Todd's company picnic, she said, which, fair enough, these things happen. But I noticed even then a small flicker of something when she walked in and saw how settled in Derek already looked, like he'd staked a claim on being the concerned one. Derek sat with me the entire day, brought me a magazine from the gift shop, fetched me ice chips, very attentive, very concerned, the whole 9 yards. And somewhere around hour 3 of sitting in that little curtained bay, he started saying things like, "Mom, we really need to get your affairs in order, just in case something like this happens again and it's worse." And, "What if you'd fallen and nobody could get into your accounts to help pay for things while you're laid up?" Which, look, on its own, sitting here telling you about it, that's not an unreasonable thing for a son to say to his mother. People genuinely do need some kind of plan for exactly that situation. I'd actually been meaning to update some of my own paperwork since Gary passed, and had just kept putting it off, the way a person does with anything that reminds you your own time is finite. About 3 weeks after that hospital visit, Derek came by the house on a Sunday afternoon with a manila folder tucked under his arm, very official looking, and said he'd found a really excellent elder law attorney, his exact words, who could draw up a power of attorney so that if anything ever happened to me down the road, one of the kids could step right in and pay bills, deal with the bank, handle whatever needed handling, without dragging the whole family through some drawn-out court process. He'd already had a draft prepared, named himself as the primary agent, with Amanda listed as the backup if he was ever unavailable. I remember asking, kind of offhand, why him first and not Amanda, since she lives closer and always has? And he gave me some answer about being better with numbers and not wanting to put that kind of stress on Amanda on top of her job and the kids. Made a certain kind of sense to me at the time, sitting right there at my own kitchen table. I signed it. My friend Carol actually happened to be there that particular Sunday for what turned into an impromptu extra coffee visit, and she ended up witnessing my signature on that document, which, hold on to that thought, because it turns out to matter enormously later in this story. Now, I need to explain something here for anybody listening who doesn't already know how this works, because I sure didn't fully understand it myself back then, and I've come to believe that's exactly how people like my son count on it playing out. A power of attorney, at least a general one like mine, basically hands somebody the legal keys to your entire financial life. Your bank accounts, your bills, your insurance policies, sometimes your actual property and real estate. It doesn't automatically mean anything sinister is happening. Plenty of perfectly normal families set these documents up every single day, and absolutely nothing bad ever comes of it. But it only works the way it's supposed to if the person holding that authority is actually acting for you, in your interest, and not quietly maneuvering around you for their own. I didn't know yet, sitting there signing my name that Sunday afternoon, which kind of situation I was actually walking into. For the first couple of months after that, honestly, everything seemed fine, or at least fine enough that I never thought twice about any of it. Derek said he wanted to simplify my bill-paying situation, set some accounts up online for me since I've never been particularly great with computers and technology in general, never had the patience for it the way some folks my age somehow do. He started handling my monthly grocery budget through some kind of app on his own phone, said it would save me repeated trips to the actual bank branch, which, again, sounded perfectly reasonable at the time, maybe even thoughtful. I did notice my checking account statements had gotten a good deal harder to actually sit down and read on paper. He'd switched everything over to paperless billing, said it was more secure that way, and I nodded along because what did I know? Little things started popping up starting around January, small enough that any one of them alone I probably would have shrugged off. My homeowner's insurance renewal notice never showed up in the mail like it always had every January, like clockwork for the last 20 years. When I finally called the insurance company directly, good and confused, they told me the policy had actually been canceled back in November. Somebody had called in and canceled it outright, using information that matched my account details closely enough that their system didn't flag anything unusual about it. I certainly hadn't canceled anything. I called Derek about it, and he got kind of defensive real quick. Said he must have accidentally canceled it while he was cleaning up and consolidating my various accounts. Thought it was some kind of duplicate policy, and he'd get it straightened out. It took him almost 6 full weeks to actually get that fixed, during which time my house sat completely uninsured through a stretch of genuinely nasty winter weather. Nothing happened, thank goodness. No fire, no burst pipe, nothing catastrophic. But nothing about that whole episode sat right with me even back then, if I'm honest about it. Then, in February, I went to use my debit card at the grocery store, same store I've shopped at for 15 years, and it got declined right there at the register. Real embarrassing. Whole line of people behind me, the cashier giving me that particular sympathetic but awkward look. I called the bank right from the parking lot, hands shaking a little if I'm being honest with you, and they told me my checking account balance stood at $340. I'd had, as of the last statement I actually remembered looking at closely, somewhere around $22,000 sitting in that account. Money that was specifically earmarked to cover the year's property taxes, which come due in one large lump sum where I live, not spread out monthly like some places do it. I drove straight over to Derek's place, still a little shaky, and he had an explanation ready almost too fast, like he'd rehearsed it. Said there'd been some pretty serious repairs needed on my house's foundation, that some contractor he knew personally had come out and done an inspection and found real structural issues that needed handling right away before they got a lot worse and a lot more expensive. And he'd had to move quickly to pay for it directly out of my account since it was, in his telling, an emergency situation. When I asked, reasonably, I thought, to see the actual contractor's invoice, the inspection report, anything at all in writing, he said the paperwork was back at his place, and he'd bring it by for me to look over. That was February. It is now July, as I'm sitting here recording this for you. I have never once, to this day, laid eyes on that paperwork. I brought all of this up at Easter, at Amanda's house, in front of both of my children together, because I figured safety in numbers, maybe. Or maybe I just needed a witness to my own sanity at that point. And this is the part that really got under my skin, more than the money even, if you can believe that. Derek got angry, not sheepish, not defensive exactly, but actually angry, like I deeply insulted him by asking, and said I was getting paranoid and starting to lose track of things ever since the fall back in October. Amanda, God love her, didn't back me up at all. Just sort of stared down at her plate of ham and scalloped potatoes and said, real quiet, "Mom, maybe we should get you checked out, just to be safe, you know? Just to rule things out." I sat there at my own daughter's Easter dinner table being told, in essence, that questioning where $20-some thousand of my own hard-earned, Gary and I saved it, money had disappeared to, was apparently a symptom of me going senile. I didn't say much through the rest of that dinner. Went home and cried sitting in my own car in Amanda's driveway before I'd even pulled out onto the road, which I'm not too proud to admit to you tonight. It got worse from there, actually, before it got anywhere near better. And I think it's important I tell you the parts that don't paint anybody in a flattering light, including myself. Because I spent a good 2 or 3 weeks after that Easter dinner genuinely doubting my own mind. I started writing myself little notes and then losing the notes, which of course only fed the fear further. I made an appointment with my regular doctor, Dr. Ferris, mostly just to prove to myself one way or another whether something really was wrong with me. She ran the full battery, memory tests, the whole clock drawing thing they do, blood work to rule out other causes. Came back completely clean. She looked me dead in the eye and said, "Linda, there is nothing here. Whatever's going on, it is not you." I sat in my car in that parking lot for a long while, too. But that time, it was a different kind of crying. Something closer to relief, mixed with a whole new kind of scared. Because if it wasn't me losing my grip, that meant the only other explanation left standing was the one I'd been too frightened to fully look at. Around that same time, I actually confided a little in a woman from my church, Beverly, somebody I've known for years, thinking maybe she'd have some wisdom for me. Beverly's advice was, essentially, family matters ought to stay within the family, Linda. You don't want to go making this uglier than it needs to be by bringing in lawyers and such against your own son. And I sat with that advice for a good week or more, genuinely torn, raised as I was to believe you handle these things quietly. You don't air family business. You find a way to forgive and move forward for the sake of peace. I even prayed on it more than once, asking for some kind of clarity on whether pursuing this properly was the right thing to do, or whether I was simply being vindictive toward my own child. What finally settled it for me wasn't some big dramatic answer from above, if I'm honest. It was just sitting alone one evening with my checkbook, doing simple arithmetic, and realizing that keeping the peace was going to cost me my own home eventually if I let it keep going unchecked. Peace that costs you everything you built isn't really peace. It's just quiet surrender with better manners. That following Tuesday, at our regular coffee, I told Carol absolutely everything. Start to finish, the whole ugly shape of it. And I have to properly tell you about Carol here, because she matters enormously to how this entire story turns out. Carol Jenks was a paralegal for almost 30 years at a firm downtown, mostly elder law and estate matters, before she retired about 6 years back. She had seen this exact pattern play out more times than she could probably count, sitting through decades of client intake at that firm. She did not say, "Oh, I'm sure it's nothing, Linda. Families are complicated." She set her coffee cup down flat on the table, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Linda, I think your son may be stealing from you, and I think we need to start writing everything down, today, right now, before this gets any further along than it already has." I remember feeling almost lightheaded with relief that somebody had finally said out loud the exact thing I'd been too scared to even fully think to myself in so many words. So that's precisely what we did, the two of us, starting that very afternoon. Every single phone call I had with Derek after that point, I wrote down the date, the time, and what was actually said, word for word as best as I could manage to remember it, sitting down right after we hung up while it was still fresh. Every bank statement I could get my hands on, I made a photocopy of at the library because heaven knows I wasn't going to use whatever printer Derek had set up in my own house by that point. Carol helped me request a full year's transaction history directly from my actual bank branch, in person, standing at the counter, not through whatever online access Derek had arranged. And it turned out, when the branch manager pulled it up, that he had both a view login and something called an assistant-level access to that account that I have absolutely no memory of ever explicitly signing off on, which, again, hold that thought, because it comes up again later with the investigator. Over about 6 weeks that spring, working most evenings at my own kitchen table, some nights with Carol sitting right there across from me with her reading glasses pushed up on her head, other nights entirely on my own, with a legal pad and a cup of chamomile tea going cold beside me, we built what Carol took to calling the file. I want to be honest with you. It was not dramatic detective work, nothing like on the television shows. It was slow, boring, tedious, going line by line down bank statements with a yellow highlighter, cross-referencing dates against phone calls, against my own kitchen calendar where I still write things down the old-fashioned way. But by the time we were done with that first pass, we had built a genuinely clear, fully dated picture of what had actually happened. Roughly $31,000 had moved out of my various accounts over about 7 months, spread out in amounts that never quite triggered one single big fraud alert from the bank all at once. Some straightforward withdrawals, a couple of so-called loans made out to a limited liability company Derek had gone and registered that spring for yet another business venture, this one apparently something to do with reselling refurbished electronics, and payments made out to that mysterious foundation contractor, whose actual business license, it turned out when Carol looked the man up properly, had quietly expired 2 full years prior to any of this. And it wasn't only money either, which is a detail I almost left out of this story because it still stings in a strange, smaller way. Sometime that same spring, I noticed Gary's old coin collection. Nothing museum-worthy, mind you, just a modest set of old silver dollars and a couple of gold coins he'd collected slowly over decades, kept in a small wooden box in the hall closet, had gone missing entirely. When I mentioned it, worried I'd simply misplaced it somewhere in my own house, Derek said he'd moved it somewhere safer after my fall, in case, in his words, someone came in and burglarized the place while you were laid up. He could not, when pressed on it later during all of this, actually produce the box, or the coins, or any explanation of where somewhere safer actually was. I still don't fully know, to this day, exactly where that collection ended up. Some losses, I've come to understand, just don't ever get a tidy resolution, and you learn to set them down eventually, even without one. Then, in June, right in the middle of Carol and me building that file, something happened that genuinely scared me more than anything up to that point. A loan officer from a bank clear across town, one I'd never so much as walked into in my entire life, called my house directly one Tuesday evening, asking to confirm some details on a home equity loan application that had come in with my name and my property listed as collateral. I told the man, real confused, that I had never applied for any such loan anywhere, let alone at his bank. He said the application had come in with a power of attorney document attached, granting whoever submitted it full authority to sign on my behalf, and something about the handwriting on a supplemental form, plus a mismatched employment history section, had struck their underwriting department as worth a second look before they processed it any further. That call is, I believe to this day, the single closest I came to losing my own house out from under me without ever even knowing the application existed in the first place. Had that particular loan officer not been diligent, not thought to pick up the phone and simply ask, I genuinely do not know how much further along that loan would have gotten before I ever caught wind of it. I hung up that phone with my hands properly shaking that time, no exaggeration, and called Carol immediately, even though it was well past 9 at night by then. We sat on the line together for over an hour, and that phone call is really what pushed us to stop simply building the file quietly in the background and start moving toward an actual attorney far sooner than we'd originally planned. Carol said to me, plain as anything, Linda, we don't have the luxury of being slow and careful about this anymore. Somebody just tried to put a lien on your house. And here's the part that still gets under my skin worse than almost anything else in this whole affair. While all of this was quietly unfolding, Derek and Amanda had apparently started having their own private conversations. I only know the shape of this now because Amanda let some of it slip out later, out of what I genuinely believe was guilt eating at her, about whether I should maybe not be living alone anymore. Not out of any real concern for my safety, as it eventually came out. Derek had actually been in touch with a realtor friend of his, getting a rough sense of what my house might fetch on the open market, and building toward the idea that if I moved into some kind of supportive living situation, as he delicately phrased it to Amanda, the house could then be sold off, with him, holding that power of attorney, being the one legally entitled to sign off on that sale himself. And that home equity loan, I'd come to believe, was likely meant to squeeze a chunk of cash out ahead of any such sale, quietly, before anybody else was even looking. A neighbor of mine, Ruth Ann, who's lived 2 doors down from me for almost 20 years and doesn't miss much of anything that happens on our little street, mentioned to me almost in passing during a normal chat over the fence about her tomato plants that she'd seen a car with a realty company's magnetic sign on the door parked in my driveway one weekday afternoon back in April while I'd been at my Thursday book club meeting. I hadn't scheduled any such visit. I never did find out for certain whether that was an actual formal appraisal or just Derek's realtor friend doing him an informal favor, driving by to eyeball the place. But either way, it told me plenty about which direction his thinking had already turned. I want to pause here for just a moment and say something plain, because I think it matters a great deal for anybody out there listening who's going through even a little bit of something similar to this. It is a very specific, ugly, disorienting kind of scared, realizing that the person quietly building a case that you're declining, that you can't be trusted with your own life anymore, isn't some stranger, isn't some con artist calling from overseas like you always hear about on the news. It's your own child. And it messes with a person's head in a way that's genuinely hard to put into words if you haven't lived through it yourself. You start actually, seriously questioning your own grip on reality, wondering if maybe you really are slipping. Because in a strange way, that explanation is almost easier to accept than the alternative, which is that somebody you raised, fed, drove to soccer practice 10,000 times is doing this to you on purpose. But I had the file by then, and that terrifying phone call from the loan officer to push us into moving faster. And I had Carol, steady as ever, 30 years of Tuesday mornings deep into our friendship by that point. That same week, Carol connected me with an elder law attorney she'd actually worked alongside years back during her paralegal days. A sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya Okonkwo, who specializes almost entirely in exactly this kind of situation: financial exploitation of older adults carried out by family members holding power of attorney. I remember sitting in Priya's small, cluttered, plant-filled office, sliding that whole thickening folder across her desk toward her, half expecting, honestly, for her to look through it and gently tell me it wasn't quite as bad as I'd built it up to be in my head. She read through it carefully for a solid 20 minutes, without saying much of anything at all, flipping pages, occasionally circling something with her own pen. Then finally looked up at me and said, plainly, "Linda, this is about as textbook a case of financial exploitation as I've seen come through this door. And honestly, it's a genuinely good thing you have this much organized documentation already, because most people who sit in that chair across from me have almost nothing written down at all when they arrive." She told me, a little later in that same meeting, that she'd gotten into this particular area of law originally because her own grandmother, back in Lagos, had been quietly taken advantage of by a nephew handling her affairs after a stroke, and that Priya had been half a world away in law school at the time and hadn't found out until it was mostly too late to recover much of anything. "I can't fix what happened to my grandmother," she told me, closing my folder gently. "But I can absolutely help make sure it doesn't finish happening to you." Priya spent a good while longer that first afternoon, just walking me through how common this whole situation actually is, which I found strangely comforting even in the middle of everything, in a way I hadn't expected. She told me her office alone sees somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 40 new cases a year that look almost exactly like mine. An adult child, or occasionally a niece or nephew, granted legitimate legal authority through a power of attorney, or, in some cases, joint ownership added onto a bank account, who then quietly starts treating that authority as though it were simply an inheritance arriving a little early. She said the pattern is so consistent across cases that she can often predict, within the first 10 minutes of a client describing their situation, roughly what's coming next in the story. The plausible-sounding explanation for the first missing chunk of money, the anger when questioned, somebody else in the family suggesting the older parent is simply getting confused. "You are, unfortunately, not special in this, Linda," she told me, not unkindly, more like she wanted me to understand I wasn't alone in it. "Which is exactly why we have a whole process built for it." She explained that the reason financial institutions and courts take these cases seriously, even when they involve family, is that the law generally doesn't distinguish between a stranger stealing from a vulnerable adult and a relative doing the exact same thing. The harm to the victim, in the eyes of the law, is functionally identical either way, whatever the family relationship happens to be. That distinction, small as it sounds, genuinely helped me going forward, because it gave me permission, in a sense, to stop measuring what Derek had done against some lesser standard just because he happened to be my son. Priya walked me through the actual legal options available to me that afternoon, step by careful step. And I'll share the broad outline here because I think it's useful, practical information, regardless of anybody listening's particular circumstances. The first step was straightforward enough: revoking the existing power of attorney entirely, which, as the person who originally granted that authority, as long as I still retained my own mental capacity, which, frankly, was never seriously in question by anyone qualified to judge it, I was fully entitled to do, simply and directly, in writing, notarized properly, effective immediately, with no court proceeding required for that particular piece of it. Second, Priya recommended we file a formal report with Adult Protective Services, which, in most states, including mine, is the specific government agency tasked with actually investigating suspected financial exploitation of older or otherwise vulnerable adults, separate and apart from the regular police, though their findings absolutely can lead to a criminal referral further down the line if warranted. Third, and this took the longest to actually play out, Priya recommended we pursue a civil claim to attempt recovering the money itself, since criminal charges, she was very upfront and honest with me about this part, can be a considerably slower, less certain road to walk, especially when the person on the other side of it is your own family member, and a jury or prosecutor might be reluctant to pursue it aggressively. We handled the revocation itself the very next morning. Carol drove me down to a little shipping and notary place not far from the bank, and I sat there at a plain folding table and signed my name to a document that, in about 4 minutes flat, undid every bit of authority Derek had been quietly abusing for the better part of a year. I remember my hand actually shook a little, signing it, which surprised me, given how much I wanted it done. The notary, a pleasant young woman who had absolutely no idea what she was witnessing the weight of, stamped it, and just like that, it was finished. Priya's office filed the revocation with the county recorder that same afternoon, and I personally walked into my bank branch with a certified copy the following day and watched the branch manager remove Derek's access from my accounts right there on her screen while I sat and waited. I sat in my car in that bank parking lot afterward for a good 10 minutes. Not crying this time, just breathing. Feeling something loosen in my chest that I hadn't fully realized had been clenched tight for months. The Adult Protective Services investigation took a little over 10 weeks from start to finish. Start to what I'd call a real conclusion, anyway. I remember making that very first intake call myself, sitting at my kitchen table with Priya's number and the hotline number both written on a sticky note in front of me, my heart going a mile a minute like I was the one doing something wrong, instead of Derek. The woman on the other end of that hotline was calm and matter-of-fact in a way that helped enormously. She didn't need me to have it all perfectly organized right there on the phone, just asked me a series of straightforward questions and told me an investigator would be in touch within a few business days. An investigator named Mr. Holloway, a soft-spoken, extremely thorough man, probably not much younger than Derek himself, came out to my house twice over that stretch, sat at my same kitchen table where all the original damage had been done, and went carefully through the same documentation Carol and I had painstakingly built up over those 6 weeks that spring. He separately and privately interviewed Derek as well, of course, standard procedure, and interviewed Ruth Ann, my neighbor, too, about that realtor's car she'd noticed, and even spoke briefly with the loan officer who'd first called me about that home equity application. Derek's account of things, as it got relayed back to me afterward in general terms by Mr. Holloway, did not remotely match the story Derek had originally told me directly. To the investigator, Derek claimed there'd been an informal understanding between the two of us that some portion of that money represented fair compensation for his time spent managing my affairs, which was never anything either of us had actually discussed, let alone agreed to, in writing or even verbally, and certainly nothing anywhere close to that kind of dollar figure. The foundation repair, as it turned out under Mr. Holloway's actual scrutiny, had been almost entirely fabricated from the ground up. The so-called contractor was, in fact, an old acquaintance of Derek's from one of his earlier failed business ventures, held no valid license whatsoever, and no actual written inspection report of any kind had ever existed in the first place. Pure invention, start to finish. When Priya arranged for a genuinely licensed, independent structural inspector to come out and properly examine my actual foundation, top to bottom, he confirmed there had never been anything remotely wrong with it at all. Not then, not ever, in his professional assessment. As for the home equity loan application, Mr. Holloway confirmed it had indeed been submitted using my personal information and a copy of the now revoked power of attorney, though it had never actually closed or funded, thanks entirely to that one diligent loan officer's second look. By July, which, as I mentioned, is right around when I'm actually sitting here recording all of this for you, so it's all still fairly raw and recent, Adult Protective Services formally substantiated their finding of financial exploitation against Derek. Now, I want to be clear with you. That finding doesn't automatically translate into criminal charges being filed. Those are separate legal processes entirely with their own, considerably higher evidentiary bar to clear. But it does go permanently on record, and it significantly strengthened the civil case Priya subsequently filed on my behalf to recover what had been taken from me. Derek, through his own retained attorney, ultimately agreed to a structured repayment arrangement rather than fight the civil case outright in open court. I strongly suspect this was because fighting it, with the file Carol and I had built, plus the formal APS findings now sitting on top of it, would have gone very badly indeed for him, and likely would have opened the door to exactly the kind of criminal referral he clearly did not want any part of. There was one meeting, right around the middle of all this legal back and forth, that I still think about more than almost anything else in the whole ordeal. A mediation session. Lawyers on both sides present, held in a plain, fluorescent-lit conference room downtown that smelled faintly of burnt coffee. Derek sat directly across the table from me for the first time since that miserable Easter dinner. He looked, I'll admit, genuinely smaller somehow than I remembered him, older around the eyes. At one point, without his own attorney's apparent blessing, judging by the look on that man's face, Derek looked straight at me and said, "Mom, I never meant for it to actually get this far. I swear to you. I just kept telling myself I'd pay it all back once the electronics thing finally took off." I didn't say much back to him in that room, not really. Priya had coached me beforehand not to engage too directly in that particular setting, to let the paperwork and the numbers do the actual talking for me. But I remember thinking, sitting there looking at my own grown son across that ugly laminate table, that I meant to pay it back eventually, is a strange, thin kind of comfort to offer somebody whose insurance you let lapse on purpose and whose foundation repair invoice never once existed anywhere outside your own imagination. Derek did try calling me several times in the weeks right after that mediation session, before the repayment agreement was fully finalized and signed. I let most of those calls go to voicemail, on Priya's advice as much as my own instinct, honestly. One message in particular, I still have saved on my phone. I'm not entirely sure why. It starts out angry, him saying I was destroying this family over money and that I'd always favored Amanda anyway. And then, maybe 90 seconds in, his voice just sort of cracks and he says real quiet, almost like he forgot he was still recording, "I don't even know how I got here, Mom. I don't know how any of this happened." I've listened to that second part more times than I probably should admit to you. Somewhere in the middle of all this, right around when the APS investigation was still ongoing, Priya's office mentioned there was a support group that met every other Wednesday evening in the community room of a Lutheran church across town, specifically for older adults who'd been through financial exploitation, most of it at the hands of family. I almost didn't go the first time. Sat in my car in the parking lot for a solid 10 minutes, trying to talk myself out of walking in, feeling foolish, feeling like I'd be airing something shameful in front of strangers. I'm glad I made myself go in anyway. There were maybe 8 of us that first evening, sitting in a loose circle on folding chairs with bad coffee and styrofoam cups. And every single story around that circle was some variation of mine. A grandson who'd cleaned out a savings account meant for a granddaughter's wedding. A niece who'd talked her aunt into signing over a car title and then never brought the car back. A son in Arizona who'd stopped visiting entirely the moment his mother finally revoked his access. An older gentleman named Frank, must have been pushing 80, told the group that night that the hardest part for him wasn't the money at all. It was that he now flinched a little every time his own daughter called his phone, waiting to hear what she needed this time. I understood that flinch completely. I still feel a version of it myself some days when Derek's name comes up on my caller ID, even now. That group didn't fix anything for me in a practical sense. Priya's legal work was doing that part. But it did something else just as necessary, which was making the whole ugly experience feel a little less like something that had marked me out as uniquely foolish or uniquely unlucky. It happens constantly. It happens to sharp people, careful people, people who raised their kids right by every measure they knew how to use at the time. I won't sit here and pretend to you that this whole story ended with some tidy movie moment where everybody hugs it out and cries and everything's magically better between us. It's not like that, not even close. Derek and I are, at best right now, in an extremely cold, formal, entirely lawyer-mediated relationship. I genuinely do not know if that ever fully thaws out into something warmer again. And some nights I've had to make a kind of uneasy peace with the real possibility that it might not fully, maybe not ever. That is a genuinely hard thing to sit with as a mother, and I won't pretend otherwise to make this story feel neater than real life actually is. Amanda, though, to her real credit, has come around further than I honestly expected her to, given how things stood at that Easter table. She sent me an actual handwritten letter, not a text message, not some quick phone call, an actual letter in the mail, apologizing specifically and by name for that Easter dinner comment, for not backing me up in the moment when it mattered most, and admitting outright that she'd known more about what Derek was actually doing, or at least strongly suspected far more than she'd ever let on to me at the time, out of what she herself called wanting to keep the peace at any cost. We are rebuilding something real there now, slowly, brick by brick, you might say. She's taken to joining Carol and me at our Tuesday morning coffee some weeks now, sliding into that same old booth, which, small as it might sound to somebody on the outside looking in, genuinely feels like something worth holding on to. Sophie, my granddaughter, has actually been the surprising bright spot through this whole ugly stretch. She's 16 now, sharp as anything, and she still comes by most Sunday afternoons like clockwork, sits with me at the kitchen table doing her homework while I putter around, same as always. She's never once asked me for the ugly details of what happened with her father, and I've never volunteered them to her, figuring that's not a burden a 16-year-old needs carrying. But she did say something to me a few weeks back, out of nowhere, while working on some geometry assignment, that I've held on to. She said, "Grandma, I'm glad you're still you." I didn't entirely know what she meant by it in the moment, whether she'd picked up more than either of us realized from overheard conversations, but I've decided not to ask, and just to let it sit as the kind thing it plainly was meant to be. Book club, of all places, is actually where the idea for telling you this story tonight first came up, believe it or not. We were supposed to be discussing some novel about a lighthouse keeper that month, and instead the whole conversation drifted, the way it does sometimes, into everybody at that table sharing their own version of a family money story. Not one single woman in that room, 7 of us total, was entirely spared some version of it, whether it was a sibling fighting over a parent's estate or a spouse who'd hidden a debt for years. One of the women, Doreen, said something that night that stuck with me. She said, "We all just sort of assume this is embarrassing to talk about, so nobody does. And then everybody feels like it only happened to them." That stuck with me for weeks afterward. It's a big part of why I eventually got comfortable enough sitting in front of a microphone telling you all of this tonight, strangers though most of you are to me. If saying it out loud, plainly, without shame attached to it, helps even one person listening recognize the same pattern starting to take shape in their own family before it gets as far along as mine did, then sitting here, being a little exposed about it, feels like a fair trade to me. The power of attorney document I have in place now, because Priya was very clear with me that I should absolutely still have one on file, for entirely practical, sensible reasons, just a far more properly structured one this time around, names Carol formally as a co-agent right alongside Amanda, with a built-in requirement that any single transaction above a certain modest dollar threshold requires both of their signatures together, not just one person acting alone. Priya calls that particular arrangement a safeguard structure in the legal paperwork. I call it, honestly, plain common sense that probably should have been sitting right there on page 1 from the very beginning, if I'm being fully truthful with myself about the whole thing in hindsight. I do want to leave you with a handful of plain, genuinely practical things before I wrap this up tonight. If you yourself, or somebody you love happen to be even a little bit in this kind of territory right now. Because I sincerely wish somebody had sat me down and told me this a full year ago, instead of me having to learn every bit of it the hard way, one painful lesson at a time. First, get your bank statements mailed to you directly on paper if you can, or at an absolute minimum, check your own accounts yourself, directly through your bank's own official website or in person at the branch. Never solely through whatever access somebody else has kindly set up on your behalf. Second, if you do sign a power of attorney, insist on a version that requires a second signature, or at minimum, a regular, scheduled accounting for anything above a set dollar amount. Any competent elder law attorney can build that safeguard in without much trouble at all. Third, keep some kind of paper trail on anything that feels even slightly off to you, even if it feels a little silly or paranoid in the moment to sit down and write it out. Even if all you can manage is jotting down, "Felt strange about this particular phone call," along with today's date. Fourth, and I learned this one the hard way with that home equity loan situation, it's worth calling your bank and any lender you've ever worked with once a year, just to ask plainly whether any new applications, authorizations, or account access changes have been made in your name that you don't personally recognize. Most institutions will tell you straight if you simply ask the right question. And finally, if your own gut is telling you something is genuinely wrong, and the people closest to you keep insisting you're simply imagining things or getting forgetful, please, I am asking you sincerely, trust the part of yourself that noticed something in the first place. Adult Protective Services exists in every single state in this country. The call is free, confidential, and you do not need to already have airtight proof in hand before you're allowed to make that first call. A few more small things, since I'm on the subject and I'd rather overshare than leave something out that might actually help somebody. Watch for insurance policies quietly lapsing, the way mine did. Most companies will still mail a physical renewal notice, so if those suddenly stop showing up, that's worth a phone call, not a shrug. Watch for new, authorized users or joint names appearing on accounts you don't remember adding, which your bank can tell you about in about 30 seconds if you simply ask a teller to review the account's authorized parties with you directly. If a family member ever tells you a repair, a medical bill, or some other expense was an emergency that required moving a large sum quickly, ask, calmly and plainly, for the actual invoice, the actual provider's name and phone number, and follow up on it yourself, rather than taking the explanation at face value, no matter how uncomfortable that feels to do to your own child. And if you ever do reach the point of formally revoking a power of attorney, notify every single financial institution you use directly and in person where at all possible. Don't assume that one notification to one bank automatically updates anywhere else, because it generally does not. I'm not going to sit here tonight and tell you I've got this whole situation completely figured out now, or that I don't still feel angry some days, because I absolutely do. Plenty of days, if I'm honest. But I've got my own name properly back on my own accounts where it belongs. I've got a friend in my corner who's been sitting across from me in that same diner booth for 30 years running and shows no sign of stopping. I've got a granddaughter who still shows up every single Sunday afternoon with her geometry homework and her whole unbothered heart. And I've got a daughter who is slowly, genuinely finding her way back to standing right next to me instead of quietly standing behind somebody else out of habit. That is not nothing, not by a long shot. Some days, if I'm honest with you, it feels like more than plenty. If any single part of this story hit close to home for you tonight, if you've ever had that particular sick, sinking feeling that something is genuinely wrong with money, and the people around you kept right on telling you not to worry your head about it, I would truly love to hear about it down in the comments below. And if you happen to be new here tonight, this channel is built entirely around real, honest stories exactly like mine. Family, money, the quiet fights that end up genuinely reshaping a person's whole life. Please, if this particular story meant something to you tonight, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps a small channel like this one reach more people out there who might really need to hear this exact story right now. Subscribe if you'd like more stories along these same lines going forward. There's a brand new one dropping every single week. Take good care of yourselves out there tonight, and take care of each other while you're at it. I'll see you in the next one.